The initial observations of Harlan Voss's actions in April led most to believe he had simply become eccentric. For 3 weeks, his property in the southern expanse of Garner County echoed with the deep rumble of a rented excavator. Passers-by on County Road 7 would slow their vehicles, peering intently, some even stopping their trucks altogether. They anticipated seeing him preparing new acreage or perhaps extending his eastern pasture by clearing more woodland. Harlan had been cultivating that land for 43 years, and while improvements were a constant, this endeavor involved digging. It was a colossal, deliberate, and meticulously shaped excavation, situated squarely in the midst of 60 acres once renowned for yielding some of the finest soybeans in the region. By the time news trickled to the local feed store, the pit had expanded to the dimensions of a football field and was deep enough to entirely engulf a person. The prevailing consensus throughout Garner County had already been reached. "He's creating a fishing hole for himself," remarked Dale Pruitt, whose cattle ranch bordered Harlan's property. "A man works his entire life and retires to a bass pond. I can't fault him for that." There were soft chuckles and a few raised eyebrows, but mostly, people just shrugged and carried on. Little did they know, before that summer concluded, many of those same neighbors would lament not having undertaken a similar project of their own. If narratives of understated wisdom and the individuals who sustain our agricultural heritage resonate with you, please subscribe and join our community. We invite you to share your location in the comments section. We're eager to discover which part of the globe you call home. Harlan Voss was not a man inclined to offer lengthy explanations. At 71 years of age, he had been born and raised on that very land in Garner County, inheriting it from his father. For 4 decades, he had coaxed harvests from soil that could be either bountiful one year or unforgiving the next. Lean and deliberate in his movements, with hands weathered by the sun and a habit of observing the sky with the intensity others reserved for their mobile devices, Harlan was not the loudest voice at co-op meetings, yet his words commanded attention. He had championed the use of cover crops long before they became a trend, and practiced crop rotation before such methods were recognized as sustainable. He possessed little inclination to justify his choices. If an action seemed sensible, he undertook it. If not, he abandoned it. Consequently, when questioned about his current undertaking, his response remained consistent. "A pond," he would state, and nothing more. Dale Pruitt was the first to express significant doubt. Managing 300 head of Black Angus cattle on the adjacent acreage, he had observed the excavation's growth for 2 weeks before approaching Harlan. "You're removing fertile land from cultivation," Dale pointed out. "That's excellent loam you're digging." Harlan simply nodded. "It is." Dale waited for further elaboration, but none was forthcoming. At Garner County Feed and Supply, Bud Eckerman, who maintained much of the county's farm equipment, shook his head over his morning coffee. "That excavator rental alone will cost him $6,000 or $7,000, Bud commented. "And for what purpose?" Maxine Trotter, who had managed the store for 30 years, offered a more measured perspective. "Harlan has undertaken actions that initially seemed illogical before," she remarked quietly, "and yet they ultimately proved sound." Gerald Fitch, a retired conservation officer, gazed out the window. "He's excavating it to the scale of a reservoir, not a simple fishing pond. That structure will hold a substantial volume of water." At the time, Gerald's observations garnered little attention. What most residents of Garner County were unaware of was Harlan Voss's harrowing experience during the summer of 1988. He had been farming for 15 years by then, and that exceptionally dry season had brought his operation to the brink of collapse. Water levels in wells plummeted, and ponds evaporated, leaving behind cracked earth. For 11 consecutive weeks, he manually transported water for his livestock and suffered a 20% loss of his crop. It took him 4 years to emerge from the resulting debt. From that ordeal, he vowed never to find himself in such a vulnerable position again. In the years that followed, he attended workshops on water management, studied university publications concerning watershed hydrology, and journeyed 4 hours to consult with a farmer named Eugene Stahl. Eugene had constructed a series of ponds in the 1970s that had sustained his farm through droughts that devastated his neighbors. Eugene had imparted a crucial lesson, that a strategically situated pond could sustain an operation through extended periods of dry weather. Harlan had been patiently awaiting the opportune moment for over 30 years. He never disclosed any of this information, nor had people pressed him for details. The project itself was not without its challenges. The excavator encountered dense clay at a depth of 12 feet, necessitating an additional 2 days of work. Subsequently, a hydraulic line ruptured, rendering the machinery inoperable for nearly a week while a replacement part was sourced from out of state. One Saturday, his daughter Renee visited, her expression a familiar echo of her mother's concerns. "Dad, the bank called. You've exceeded their comfort level with the operating line of credit." "I'm aware," Harlan replied. "What will you tell them?" He cast his gaze toward the partially completed pond, devoid of water, its raw edges exposed to the spring sunshine. "The truth." The bank reluctantly granted a brief extension. Harlan completed the excavation himself, carving shallow channels along the sloping terrain to guide surface runoff directly into the basin, entirely eliminating the need for pumps or electrical infrastructure. No machinery, no power, only the force of gravity and meticulous foresight. What Harlan had constructed was what agricultural engineers term an on-farm reservoir. This was not a recreational farm pond, but one designed for survival. A properly engineered farm pond effectively captures surface runoff, rainwater, and snowmelt that would otherwise flow away or evaporate. Positioned at the lowest point of a watershed, it can accumulate millions of gallons during wetter periods, subsequently supplying water for livestock throughout the summer, feeding gravity-fed irrigation systems, and replenishing the surrounding groundwater table. The critical factor is its scale. A pond that is too small will fill and overflow, wasting its potential. Conversely, a pond appropriately sized for its watershed will efficiently capture and retain water. Harlan had engineered his to hold an estimated 18 million gallons. He lined the outlet with a concrete standpipe, planted native grasses along the banks to mitigate erosion, and graded shallow channels to direct runoff from the northern slope directly into the reservoir. It was not intended for recreation. It was a water bank. As spring transitioned into summer, the pond gradually filled. Late May rainfall and the slow runoff from the north slope contributed to its replenishment. By June, it contained 6 feet of water, appearing dark and serene in the morning light. Onlookers driving past assumed Harlan was content with his achievement. But that same June, Gerald Fitch observed the creek on the northern outskirts of town flowing at a level he hadn't witnessed in 20 years. Roy Caldwell, whose irrigated corn operation was located 12 miles to the east, reported his well was operating under increased strain. The county agricultural report noted that the preceding winter's snowpack had been significantly below average, and subsoil moisture levels were trending below historical norms. The older farmers at the feed store began recalling the events of 1988. The migratory patterns of birds appeared altered, with them heading north earlier than usual, as if compelled by some unseen force from behind. The air in July carried a distinct aroma, dry and dusty, the kind that permeates clothing and lingers. By August, the county could no longer maintain its pretense of normalcy. Crops that should have stood tall and vibrantly green appeared pale and brittle, rustling ominously in the hot wind. Ponds that had been full in May now exhibited exposed, muddy edges, quickly giving way to parched, cracked earth. Dale Pruitt's cattle operation was incurring significant expenses for supplemental water, a cost that tightened his jaw in frustration. The Extension Office issued a drought advisory, which soon escalated to a warning. Well levels continued to drop, with some failing entirely by September. Irrigation restrictions were imposed across 3 townships. Roy Caldwell's well ran dry on a Tuesday morning. The summer of 1988 had seemingly returned. Harlan's pond, however, still held 12 feet of water at the close of August. The spring rains had established a substantial reserve, and the sheer volume of water stored meant its depletion was gradual, lagging weeks behind the point at which his neighbors' ponds had become dry. He had successfully implemented gravity-fed lines to his pastures, irrigating 200 acres throughout the peak of the summer heat. His livestock drank without any limitations. His soybean fields, situated on higher ground, experienced stress, as did all crops across the county. But his lower-lying acres, irrigated from the pond, continued to produce. Harlan acknowledged that the pond had not salvaged everything, but it had provided him with crucial time, perhaps 8 to 10 weeks of water when the rest of the county had none. In the context of drought management, weeks can represent the difference between a challenging season and a completely ruined one. Dale Pruitt arrived at Harlan's property on a Thursday afternoon in September. Dale was not a man who would allow his pride to indefinitely hinder a pragmatic discussion. He stood at the edge of the pond, observing it for an extended period. The water level had receded since May, but it was still present. Wide and dark, it reflected the passing clouds. "How much do you have remaining?" Dale inquired. "Enough," Harlan responded. A great blue heron was actively fishing along the far bank, unhurried, in water that should not have been there. "I suppose I was mistaken about the purpose of this," Dale admitted finally. Harlan offered no reply, simply continuing to gaze at his pond. That autumn, the Garner County Extension Office organized a public forum on agricultural water resilience. Gerald Fitch presented alongside a state hydrologist, and the room was 3 times more crowded than anticipated. Harlan sat in the back row. When individuals approached him afterward with questions, he answered them candidly. He provided his telephone number to 4 young farmers who expressed a desire to tour his property and examine the pond's design firsthand. The following spring, Dale Pruitt broke ground on his own reservoir. Roy Caldwell followed suit. By the subsequent year, 7 agricultural operations within the county had either constructed or were planning to implement on-farm water storage systems. For the first time, the County Agricultural Report included a dedicated section on farm pond construction and watershed management. Maxine Trotter placed a copy of that report prominently on the counter at the feed store. Harlan never uttered a word of vindication. That was not his nature. However, when young farmers stopped by to inquire about how he had foreseen the need, he offered the same quiet response. "I didn't know," he would explain. "I simply remembered." There is a saying attributed to Masanobu Fukuoka, the Japanese farmer and philosopher. The ultimate goal of farming is not the growing of crops, but the cultivation and perfection of human beings. Harlan Voss had no intention of imparting a lesson to anyone. His sole objective was to safeguard what he had dedicated his life to building. Yet, in doing so, with quiet determination, without argument, acting upon hard-earned memories and patient planning, he provided his community with something that transcended mere water. He demonstrated that preparation is not a manifestation of pessimism, that long-term thinking is not mere stubbornness, and that sometimes the most judicious decisions appear, from an external perspective, precisely like a retired farmer excavating his own fishing pond. The land imparts these lessons slowly, and only to those who are truly willing to listen. What decision have you made that others initially questioned, but which time has ultimately validated? Share your experience in the comments.